Thank you, Prof. Tulatsky. Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to you tonight. I really appreciate it. And Prof. Tulatsky requested me to talk about funding of early stage technology startups. And that's based on my experience working with in the technology funding space, and so I've worked for the Technology Innovation Agency. Currently I do consulting for technology startups and help them with developing their projects and raising funding. So it is really a pleasure for me to be here and share some of my experiences and knowledge with you. Based on the brief that I got, I took it that most of you would be considering or are already working on early stage technology startups in the medical field. So I will address three topics. I will talk about the types of startups that there are. It is very important for us to understand that, so that we know what kind of funding are we looking at. And the other important consideration is how does that startup funding actually work? And so I'll spend a bit of time on that one. And I will sort of highlight where one can find startup funders in South Africa. So we have two types of startups. We have what are called funded startups, and there is the other type is what are called bootstrap startups. Now, funded startups are basically businesses that are financed by receiving money from investors, and these investors would, in return for their money, get equity in the business. So they typically do not generate income for quite sometimes it can go for a long time, or they might generate income, but the income is not enough to keep them going. So those would be funded startups. And many times when we talk in the startups about funding for startups, we tend to think about these kinds of startups. But the bootstrap startups are actually another type of startups. And these are the kind that actually generate enough revenue from their operations. And typically, they are not very compatible with the venture capital funding approach. And I think I'll focus here on some of the characteristics of these kinds of startups, just to distinguish them from the typical funded startups. So often they serve a very specific need. So they would have a very limited scope for scaling. And they also tend to have a strong local component. So it means that it would typically be very hard to replicate these kinds of businesses elsewhere in other countries, and all that, because there is a very specific need that is peculiar to the locality where they are founded. And one of the things that sort of where they're seen as not compatible with VC funding is that they do not generate returns that are big enough for VC companies, VC firms to actually be attracted to them. But what is very important is that these kinds of businesses can still be very profitable. So they are not to be looked at as not important, but they are very, very important. So when one is actually involved in establishing a startup and actually looking for funding for their startup business, it's very, very important to understand what kind of business they are actually looking at. Is it a funded business startup, or is it a bootstrapped type of startup? And it is very important because actually looking for funding for a startup is actually quite it's actually costly to the startup. It takes a lot of time, and what is also important to realize is that none of the two is necessarily easy. They both present significantly challenging paths. So it is really, really more important to look at, for example, I've given here the characteristics of a bootstrapped startups. And if the characteristics of what you're looking at fit here, it is best. Okay, so here I have the characteristics of a bootstrapped startup. So it is very important to look at these characteristics like these to ensure that you, for example, do not spend a lot of energy and the resources, and typically very limited resources of a startup, seeking venture capital funding when the type of business that you're looking at does not actually need that. For example, it can take sometimes between 3 and 6 months, for example, going through due diligence with a venture capital firm to actually raise money. And that could be the time that you could actually be using to, one needs to assess whether that kind of effort and time can actually be used in pursuing clients and generating income through the products of the startup itself. So I will look now at how startup funding actually works. So both, I would say, the beginning of a funded and a bootstrapped funding, a bootstrapped startup is most likely to be the same, and that is a lot of what Prof. Dulatsky spoke about around the ideation and the validation of the idea that, or the innovation that the company is actually trying to bring to the market. Now, so from this, in this case, we would look at what Prof. Dulatsky was talking about earlier, from a point of view of funding. So when you have an idea, you would need money to actually pursue that idea. So, well, and the kind of money that you need also depends on what you're actually doing. For example, if it's a project, or it's an idea that you can use your own time, maybe just extra time. If you have a job that you're already doing, you can do that after your regular job. That could be a way of actually getting that idea to start. And but sometimes you probably may need to dedicate time, or you may need to hire people, for example, like developers. You may need to hire or tools and sometimes even incubators. You may need to actually pay to use their equipment. So there, to actually develop the idea. So typically you would need, in the ideation stage, as Prof. Dulatsky was explaining, if you're following the lean startup methodology, you would need very little money, and then validate the idea, and you would probably reach a stage where you need a bit more money. And that is a point at which, if you look at the diagram that I have there, where you would need family and friends and people who can give you, who can start investing in that business. Now, so this model here is it's probably American, European. In South Africa, it is a bit challenging. The context of raising money from friends and family. Many people within our in our country would not have friends and family who have enough money, like 150,000, 200,000 rands, even 2 million rands, to actually put into a startup business and give you enough resources to actually go and validate your idea, develop the products and the prototypes, and validate either through the market and in any other way that would be appropriate. And so, in my experience, this part is in many cases filled by government institutions and some probably organizations like Incubators that are also funded as non-profit organizations. And so that would be a place to look for this kind of funding. Well, it doesn't exclude friends and family though, but it's just not in our country. Many people will not have friends and family who have the kind of funding that can take a business through this stage. Now, so once you have actually, so actually in this stage, what you would be funding, usually a lot of the money goes into developing the product and probably doing very small scale validations where people start testing that you can actually test that people actually would buy that idea, but you would not necessarily be producing the volumes to enough volumes to actually sustain the business. It's when you start raising what is seed funding that you could actually get to start producing to satisfy the market need beyond just simply testing that there is demand for that. And it is when you start doing seed funding that you start finding venture capital companies that can fund you there. But so usually in South Africa, these kinds of venture capital firms would be called early stage VCs. But what is required, what they typically require is that you should actually be generating revenue. So even though they're called early stage VC funders, typically they require that you should have shown that you can generate revenue out of that the product that you are actually, or product or service that you that you are developing. And it is quite difficult to get to that point. So and then you can, beyond the seed fund, you can get the Series A. In my experience, a lot of when you hear people raising money in South Africa in the order of 10 million rands and the likes, it's usually in the Series A space. They actually have been selling and operating as a fully fledged business for quite some time. And it's usually for scaling up. And that's where it's much easier to it's the stage where it is much easier to raise funding in South Africa. But getting there is not that easy, because you can see that you need to have gone through quite a number of stages. Now, and one of the things that is very important in going through these phases of funding is to understand very clearly what it is that you are raising funding for. Many times, sometimes I've observed people looking for funding where it is. I think this probably comes from that some of the sources of funding for startups is competitions. So it actually looks like you're being rewarded for something that you have done. But I think a better way of looking at this is that when you're going through the stages raising funding, you're always raising funding to do the next thing rather than being rewarded for what you have done before. And therefore, when you actually so for example, when you're actually raising, when you're in the ideation stage and using friends and family type of money, or money from incubators, and I'll talk later about some of the agencies that, in my view, at least in our country, given the challenges of intergenerational wealth within families and all that, that sort of close that gap. When you are approaching these kinds of funders, you have to be clear about what do you need the money for. But this kind of clarity also helps you to also determine whether do you really need funding to go forward, or you're looking at a kind of business that can bootstrap itself and keep going with, and just rather focus on generating revenue and keep going. So just looking at the kinds of funders that we have in South Africa, I think a significant part of the early stage funding, sort of pre-seed and into seed funding, are state agencies, and the Technology Innovation Agency, especially from a technology startup point of view, is quite an important player in that space. You can actually get from the Technology Innovation Agency funding from around 500,000 rands up to a few million rands, into 10 million rands or so, depending on the kind of project that you're looking at. You can also, but what is important when you are approaching the Technology Innovation Agency, their mandate is based very much on science and so outcomes of scientific research, as well as the inventions of new ways of doing things. That's usually what they would look at, and then they provide you funding to actually take those concepts into commercial products and taking them into the market. The other, I think, very useful one for, again, this stage of early, ranging from ideation to just even pre-seed funding or into seed funding, is the DTI's support program for industrial innovation. It's called SPI. And they can also fund from 500 to it's significantly lower than what the Technology Innovation Agency can fund. Now, the thing with the SPY program is that they usually fund, they tend to be reluctant to fund, let's say, people's time and things like that, but they do actually fund that. It's just that you will have to explain quite a lot of things to get funding, especially if you need money that is more than R1 million, that is mostly, say, for technology developers and engineers, and that goes into their salaries and things like that. But if you're funding, say, protecting IP and getting certifications for your products to be approved, those kind of things, they're very keen on actually providing support for that. So you do need to have core funding for SPY, while in the Technology Innovation Agency, you do not always need to have core funding. They can always fund everything. Now, CEDA also has an interesting funding scheme or fund, they call it a fund, for innovation, and which they call the Technology Transfer Fund. It actually has two parts. The one part is actually funding equipment, so things like the 3D printers and other those kind of equipment. If you need that kind of equipment, they can actually provide funding for that. They also require core funding. I think it's in about 10%, and they can fund up to 600,000 rands of equipment. Then they have another part which is more aligned with the name of the fund, the Technology Transfer Fund, where you can actually where if you, let's say there is a technology that was developed by another organization, but your startup is able to purpose that technology and develop its products on the basis of that technology. They can fund the transfer of that technology from the owners to your business. Now, the other, I think, category of of funders of early stage innovation are startup incubators. Now, some of the incubators, they usually would talk about non-financial support, but they can also provide support. I know, for example, the Technology Innovation Agency actually can provide funding through the incubators. So they distribute some of their funds to be dispersed through incubators. Now, for such in such cases, it's very important for one to familiarize themselves with the startups, or rather with the incubators within their community or around where their businesses are, and reach out to them and see what kind of financial support they have. They also host competitions, and competitions are also a very important basis for both raising funding and also validation of your ideas and meeting other innovators. And it's always encouraging to see what others are doing, how far they are, and yes, one can get money to do the next thing. Some competitions, because some competitions provide that. Now, the other category is venture capital firms. But as I indicated earlier, most venture capital firms in South Africa require that you should actually have validated quite a lot about your idea, and you should have done validations to the extent that you're actually generating income. So it is always very important to check what the mandates of the venture capital firms that you can approach are, because it is very important to ensure compatibility. During the discussion, if this could interest people, you can ask. But actually, there's one startup that has had a very bad experience out of not being compatible with a venture capital funder. It was a potential funder with quite bad consequences. So it's very important to check mandate, and that's why it's also very important to know what do you really need the funding for. And so SAFCA, that is the Southern African Venture Capital and Private Equity Association, is a very good source for potential venture capital firms that one can consider, but always understand what the mandate is and try to see if they're compatible, because it also takes a lot of time and resources to engage a venture capital firm, and so you really do not want to waste energy and time speaking to a venture capital firm that is not compatible or will not be compatible with what you do. I will end my presentation here. Thank you.